In this video, we're going to take a look at the drop shadow layer style effect. Now to add this, I'm just going to select our stick figure layer that I've been using in several of the videos up to this point, though I did convert him over to a solid color layer so I can change his color, but that's okay. Let's go ahead and just click on the effects button, and we'll click on drop shadow. Now we did just get a little drop shadow. It's very faint. The reason it's so faint is that I have a pretty high resolution document that's been scaled down, so the effect is very tiny. As soon as you get a drop shadow in place, you can immediately move the drop shadow around by clicking and dragging in your document. That is kind of a nice little secret setting that is very, very handy if you need to have your shadow at a specific angle, at a specific distance, or maybe covering a specific item in the background. It's just a whole lot easier than trying to manually handle the angle and the distance. Now let's take a look at some of these settings. The first thing we have at the very top is the blend mode and color for our drop shadow. Now unfortunately, because we have a white background, it's going to be a little tricky for us to see the result of blend shadows and color changes. So I'm going to click OK, which will just apply our shadow. And then I'll click on my background layer, we'll go to File, Place, and I'm going to put any picture in the background. It doesn't really matter which one I choose. But let's do something that's not super crazy contrasty. We'll grab our little koala because he's mostly gray, and we'll I'll hit Alt and Shift so I can scale him up nice and big in the background and press Enter. Now we can see the result of that shadow and how it's affecting our background. If I double click my layer style icon there in the background, the little FX, and go back down to my drop shadow settings, that will take us back. I do want to point this out as well. If we expand our effects, that you can see that. Now, also, a quick aside, so it's kind of an aside within an aside. I have my preferences set up so that all of my effects come in collapsed by default, and that just saves space inside my layers panel. If they are coming in opened up by default, that's just a singular setting. If you double click on the drop shadow effect itself, that takes you right to those settings without having to select it in the layer style window. Just something I thought I'd throw your way. So, our blend mode and our color. Multiply will work for 90% of your shadows, and it'll be great, but you're not limited to it. For instance, if you click on this, you have all kinds of different results you could switch to, or blend modes. So we could switch this to difference and use white instead, and so we're inverting the colors underneath. Maybe not the most practical thing ever, but you could certainly do it. We could switch it to overlay and start actually grabbing a color. And you can see how that actually has some sort of interesting color result on our koala in the background. So you can start using all kinds of combinations of blend modes and colors to get very, very special stylized shadows as you need to. Now for our examples, I'm going to leave this set to multiply, and I'm going to leave the color set to black, because that really is kind of your basic white light shadow effect. Down from here we have opacity, and this is extremely straightforward. This just allows you to change the opacity of your shadow. I do highly recommend that when you're using drop shadow, you do make some sort of a tweak to opacity. Don't leave it at the default, and make a tweak to the angle and distance as well. And the reason I say this, and it may sound a little pretentious for me to say, so if it does and you find yourself getting a little put off, I do sincerely apologize. But when you're showing your work to folks, understand that several of the folks out there you may be showing it to already know Photoshop pretty well, and they can spot the result of default values from a mile away. And so to keep things looking like you actually put a little work into the drop shadow and you didn't just click a button and walk away, it's a good idea to make some changes so you're not just using those default values. It's not something you'll run into all the time. You may never run into it, actually, but I just thought I'd mention that if folks can spot your default values, it can reflect poorly, especially if they're trying to gauge how well you worked on something. Anyway, so if we take a look at distance, you see how that works. This just shows how far away your shadow is from its source, and angle is pretty straightforward as well. Now you'll notice there is a global light checkbox, and that is active right now, so any changes I make to the angle of the light are affecting the global light itself and changing its angle as well. Now, down from here we have spread and size. These control the shape of the shadow itself. If I increase the size, we get kind of a blurring effect. It smears out the shadow. Basically, what you have here is a transition between completely dark and completely transparent. And to really show this off, I'll kick up the opacity on our shadow so that we get full blacks right back there in the background. And as you increase the size, you're just increasing that band of transition from completely dark to completely transparent. Next you have spread, and what that's going to do is take the inside darker areas of the shadow and push them back out to fill in that transitional area. So if you find yourself spreading your shadow out too far and you didn't mean to lose all of your shadow detail, you can use spread to fill the shadow back in just a little bit. You can't overdo it though, so if you crank your size up way too far and start really blisteringly high spread settings, you can just get like nasty, ugly blobs. So remember, subtlety is often key here. Okay, next we have our quality setting, and to really show this off, let me make a couple of adjustments. We'll go to right about here. Now contour, we've already talked about the contour window. In this case, what you're doing is controlling the shape or the mapping from the outermost area of the shadow where you have full transparency to the innermost area where you have full opacity. And you're controlling the relationship between the two. So at the outside, we have full transparency with a linear relationship flowing to full opacity, and we can set this to any shape that we like. So we can do a standard kind of S-curve for ease in, ease out, or we can grab presets for sawtooth, etc. and so forth, and get some really out-of-this-world style effects. And we've already talked about this window in a separate video. Next, we have a noise value that we can apply to our shadow. And what this does is any area of the shadow can get just a little bit of graininess. It's really just kind of a slider that allows control over how much graininess you have. Now you might be asking yourself, why would you ever want to do that? Well, if you're working off grainy source material to begin with, like in this case, you'll see that our koala has been scaled up, and so the image itself is kind of grainy back there. If we really wanted things to feel like they were blending in very naturally, it may look a little better to apply just the tiniest amount of noise to that shadow, just to make it look like the shadow was a part of the original image. It comes in really handy when you need it, though you can crank it up and make it just so absolutely apparent that it just looks hideous. So, like so many things, subtlety is going to be key. Next, we have Layer Knocks Out Drop Shadow. This will be a little hard to see the result of unless you jump over to your blending options and take your fill opacity and slide that down to 0. Because in this case, that makes the pixels of the actual image of the layer disappear, and all we see is the result of the layer style, in this case our drop shadow. If I switch off Layer Knocks Out Drop Shadow, we get to see the entire shadow. It's no longer cut out by where those original pixels existed. So it's just a question of whether or not you want to be able to cut that away or not. It is pretty handy leaving this on, so it is on by default, but if for any reason you need to be able to see all the way through that, then there you have it. Next, you can take any settings that you have established for your drop shadow and make those the default. So if you love this kind of shadow and you know you're going to need this for a good long while and you don't want to have to make all of these changes, by all means just click on Make Default. I tend not to use this. I like to leave defaults at their defaults because as soon as you change them, they are in fact no longer defaults. So if you find some settings that you like, I would recommend that you save those out as a brand new style, and then you can just build up from there. So you could just like click on the new style button and call this something like My Perfect Drop Shadow, and go ahead and click OK. And now in this case, because I had the include layer blending options set as well, that will set my fill opacity. So I'll go ahead and just accept that and we won't worry about it. But if I click OK now, I can create a brand new layer. So let's just make a new layer, and I'll get my paintbrush out, and let's see, let's just do just a real quick smiley. So we painted that in white. So now I can open up his layer styles. We can go up to styles and drop on My Perfect Drop Shadow, and there's the result with a single click. So there's just a couple of different ways to go about doing that. Now I'm going to right click and just delete that style, like so. And now we can go back, and I think at this point we've now covered all of the options for the drop shadow layer style effect, which will wrap things up for this video. So thanks a lot for watching.